You watched me grow up, Silas. You're my guardian, my mentor. So please don't look at me like that, she whispered, her voice trembling as he stepped into her space, his shadow swallowing her whole in the cold, moonlit library. Welcome, Helen Romance library lovers. If stories of forbidden love and dangerous men make your heart race, please support me by subscribing. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers so I can bring you more addictive tales that will leave you breathless. Your support means the world to me. Now, tell me in the comments. Is it a betrayal to fall for the man who is meant to be your protector, or is some love just inevitable? Let's dive into Alara Moretti and Silas Vance's story. The iron gates of the Moretti estate groaned as they swung open, a sound that felt less like a welcome and more like a warning echoing across the sun-drenched hills of the Tuscan countryside. Alara Moretti sat in the back of the armored sedan, her fingers twisting the silver ring on her right hand, a nervous habit she had never quite managed to kick, even after 4 years in London. Outside the tinted glass, the landscape was a blur of silver-green olive groves and ancient stone walls, a beauty that felt violent in its perfection. It had been years since she had fled this house for the gray, anonymous safety of a life dedicated to art history and rain-slicked pavement, trading the smell of gunpowder for the scent of old books and turpentine. She had hoped never to return, but the sudden death of Don Lorenzo Moretti was a summons that not even the English Channel could drown out. As the car pulled into the sweeping gravel driveway, the villa loomed over her like a fortress. It was a monument to her family's legacy, a place where business was conducted in hushed tones behind mahogany doors and where loyalty was the only currency that never devalued. Alara stepped out of the vehicle, the heat of the Italian sun hitting her like a physical weight. The courtyard was already filled with men in dark suits, their faces etched with a grim, practiced mourning. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and subtle disdain. She was the prodigal daughter, the one who had turned her back on the bloodline to pursue a life of quiet academia. To them, she was an outsider, a guest at her own father's funeral. She climbed the marble steps, her heels clicking rhythmically against the stone, a sharp staccato that seemed to irritate the heavy silence of the estate. At the top of the stairs stood a figure that made her breath hitch in her throat. Silas Vance. He was exactly as she remembered, yet entirely different. Known in the underworld as the architect of death, Silas had been her father's most lethal shadow, his right hand, and her own childhood hero. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his black suit perfectly tailored to a frame that seemed broader, more imposing than it had 4 years ago. His face was a mask of stoic calm, but his eyes, dark, sharp, and unblinking, tracked her every movement with the predatory focus of a hawk. "Alara," he said as she reached the landing. His voice was a low, melodic rumble that she felt in the small of her back. "You've arrived. Your father would have wanted you here." "My father is in the ground, Silas. Let's not pretend he is once anymore," Alara replied, her voice sounding thinner than she intended. She tried to push past him, but he stepped into her path, not touching her, but exerting a physical presence that was impossible to ignore. "The house is full of wolves today," Silas murmured, leaning in just enough for her to catch the scent of cedarwood and dark tobacco. "They are looking for a sign of weakness in the Moretti line. Try to look like your father's daughter, even if you've forgotten how to be one." Sienna felt a flash of irritation. "I haven't forgotten anything, Silas. Especially not why I left this place." She moved past him into the grand foyer, where the air was thick with the cloying, heavy scent of lilies, the smell of death disguised as grace. Throughout the afternoon, the funeral rites proceeded with a cold liturgical precision. Alara sat in the front row of the private chapel, feeling the weight of 100 gazes on the back of her neck. Every rival family was there, ostensibly to pay respects, but Alara knew they were there to measure the height of the empty throne. Silas stood in the shadows behind her, a silent sentinel who seemed to absorb the tension of the room. He didn't speak to the other men. He didn't need to. His reputation preceded him, a dark aura of violence that kept the wolves at a distance. After the burial, as the sun began to sink behind the jagged peaks of the mountains, the guests retreated to the villa for the traditional wake. Alara found herself standing on the balcony of the library, looking out over the family's vast vineyards. The peace was an illusion. In the rooms behind her, men were already whispering about the future, about who would take control of the Moretti shipping routes and the lucrative territories her father had held with an iron fist. "You look like you're plotting an escape," a voice said from the darkness behind her. Alara didn't turn. She knew the cadence of that voice too well. It had been the soundtrack to her childhood. "I'm not plotting, Silas. I'm mourning." "Is that still allowed here, or is it considered a breach of protocol?" Silas stepped up to the stone balustrade beside her, his silhouette sharp against the deepening indigo of the sky. "Mourning is a luxury for those who don't have a target on their backs. Your father knew that. He spent his life making sure you wouldn't have to carry this weight, yet here you are, the last of the name." "I'm only here for the funeral," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Once the will is read tomorrow, I'm back on a plane to London. I want nothing to do with this business, Silas. You know that. My father knew that." Silas turned his head, his dark eyes searching her face in the twilight. There was a flicker of something in his expression, not pity but a grim, hidden knowledge that made her skin prickle. "Your father knew many things, Alara. Some of them he took to the grave. Others he left for me to handle." "What does that mean?" she asked, her heart beginning to thud against her ribs. "It means that the Moretti legacy isn't something you can just resign from," Silas said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a caress. "It's in your blood. And blood has a way of calling you home, whether you want to hear it or not." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing hers. For a moment, the air between them was electric, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the forbidden history between the daughter of the house and the man who guarded its darkest secrets. Alara felt a sudden, terrifying urge to reach out and touch the rough wool of his jacket, to find an anchor in the storm she felt brewing. "You were the one who taught me how to hide," she whispered. "You were the one who told me to run." "I told you to run so I wouldn't have to watch you fall," Silas rasped, his gaze dropping to her lips. "But you're back now. And the rules have changed." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving her alone in the dark. Alara looked out at the lights of the valley, feeling the first stirrings of a trap closing around her. She had come for a funeral, but as the wind picked up, carrying the salt of the sea and the scent of lemons, she realized she might be staying for a war. The morning following the funeral arrived with a deceptive serenity. The Sicilian sun spilled over the villa's limestone terraces, gilding the lemon groves in a light that suggested life was simple and virtuous. But inside the study, where the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the ghost of Don Lorenzo's Turkish cigarettes, the atmosphere was anything but peaceful. Alara stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching a pair of hawks circle the valley. She felt the weight of the house pressing in on her, a physical force that made every breath feel earned. Behind her, the family's longtime attorney, Signor Bartoli, was meticulously arranging documents on the heavy mahogany desk. Silas Vance sat in one of the leather armchairs, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert, a predator at rest. He hadn't said a word since they entered the room, yet his presence dominated the space, a dark anchor in the center of Alara's swirling anxiety. "Please, Signorina Moretti, sit," Bartoli said, his voice trembling slightly. He had served the family for 40 years, but the vacuum left by Lorenzo clearly terrified him. "I'll stand," Alara replied, her voice clipped. "Just read the will, Signor. I have a flight to London in 6 hours, and I'd like to be on it." Bartoli cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. He began to read the formal preamble, a long list of properties, offshore accounts, and shipping interests that sounded more like a sovereign nation's ledger than a personal estate. Ilara listened with a sense of detachment. She wanted none of it. She wanted her quiet flat, her archives, and a life where no one looked at her hands to see if they were stained with blood. And finally, Bartoli continued, his voice dropping an octave, we come to the matter of the Moretti syndicate and the primary inheritance. To my daughter, Ilara, I leave the title of Donna and the controlling interest in all family operations. However, he paused, glancing nervously at Silas. Understanding that my daughter has chosen a path away from our traditions, and recognizing the wolves that gather at our gates, I hereby enact the Regency Clause. Ilara's heart skipped a beat. The what? The Regency Clause, Silas answered for him, his voice a low, smooth vibration that seemed to crawl up her spine. He stood up, closing the distance between them with a slow, deliberate stride. It's an old family tradition, Ilara. 1. Your father was revived specifically for this transition. Bartoli continued reading, his voice shaking now. I appoint Silas Vance as regent and legal guardian of the Moretti estate and its heir. Until Ilara reaches the age of 25, or until she marries a man of the council's choosing, Silas Vance shall have total and absolute authority over all assets, security, and the movement of the heir herself. Ilara is forbidden from leaving the ancestral lands without the regent's express, written consent. The room seemed to shrink. Ilara stared at the attorney, her mind reeling. You're joking. This is the 21st century. You can't keep a grown woman prisoner on an island because of a piece of paper. In the eyes of the Italian state, perhaps, Silas said, stepping into her line of sight. But in the eyes of the families who control these hills, that paper is law. Your father knew that if you left for London today, you wouldn't survive the week. The other families would see your departure as a vacuum, and they would fill it with your blood. So his solution was to hand me over to you? Ilara hissed, her eyes blazing with a mixture of betrayal and fury. He trusted you to protect me, Silas, not to own me. Protection and ownership are often indistinguishable in this world, Ilara, Silas replied. He was so close now she could see the faint, jagged scar at the edge of his jawline, a reminder of the violence he had endured for her father. I have no desire to be your jailer, but I will not be the man who lets the Moretti name die because you're too stubborn to see the targets on your back. Ilara turned back to the lawyer. There has to be a way out. A loophole. Bartoli shook his head sadly. The Don was very thorough, Signorina. The accounts are locked. Your credit cards, your London lease, and your very identity are tied to the estate. Without Silas's signature, you don't exist. The reality of the trap closed around her like a physical weight. She was trapped in the one place she hated, under the thumb of the one man who made her blood run hot with a confusion she refused to name. She looked at Silas, seeing the saint her father had relied on, but she also saw a man who was now the absolute master of her fate. You think this will make me fall in line? She challenged, stepping closer until her chest was nearly touching his. You think you can just play at being the Don while I sit in my room and embroider? Silas's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened, a flash of something raw and hungry flickering in the depths. He reached out, his hand hovering near her waist before he pulled it back, clenching it into a fist at his side. I think you're going to learn that your father's trust in me was the most dangerous gift he ever gave you. If you found out your protector was actually your greatest temptation, would you honor the past or follow your heart? Tell me in the comments below. Signor Bartoli, you're dismissed, Silas said, never breaking eye contact with Ilara. As the attorney scurried out of the room, the silence that remained was heavy and suffocating. Ilara felt the walls of the villa closing in, the Mediterranean sun outside now feeling like the light of a prison yard. She was the Donna in name, but Silas was the hand on the hilt of the sword. "I hate you," she whispered, the words sounding more like a plea than a threat. "I know," Silas replied, his voice a low, dangerous caress as he turned toward the door. "But by the time this is over, you'll realize that hate is the only thing keeping you alive. Welcome home, Elara. Your shadow is waiting." The transition from heiress to prisoner was swifter than the Mediterranean tides. By the third evening of her captivity, Elara felt the very walls of the villa beginning to close in, their ancient stones breathing with the weight of her father's secrets. The Regency clause had stripped her of her digital life. Her phone was a paperweight, the Wi-Fi signal at the estate was a ghost, and the landlines were rerouted through a switchboard in the security office. Every exit was manned by men who looked at her with a mixture of pity and steel. But the most suffocating part of her confinement wasn't the locked gates. It was the man who had moved into the suite directly adjacent to hers. Silas had claimed the sentinel's quarters, a room connected to her own by a heavy, interconnected dressing room. In the old days, it was where Donna's personal maid would sleep. Now, it was the lair of the family's most dangerous predator. Elara could hear him through the thin gaps in the woodwork, the rhythmic tread of his boots, the soft click of a pistol being cleaned, and the low, melodic gravel of his voice as he issued orders to the guards in the courtyard below. "I'm not a child, Silas," she shouted through the locked connecting door when the sun began to dip toward the horizon on the fourth day. "You don't need to be this close. I can't even take a shower without feeling your eyes on the door." There was a moment of silence, and then the lock on the dressing room door clicked. Silas stepped into the threshold, his presence immediately making the large room feel cramped. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms etched with the faint, jagged maps of a violent life lived in service to her name. "If you were a child, Elara, you'd be safer," Silas said, his voice a low vibration that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "Children are ignored. Women with your name are trophies. And trophies are stolen." "So you're the vault?" she challenged, pacing the length of the silk rug. "You're going to sit here and watch me rot until I turn 25 or marry some chinless wonder the council picks out for me?" Silas leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. The movement made his muscles strain against the fabric of his shirt, a visual reminder of the sheer physical power he wielded over her. "I'm going to make sure you live long enough to make your own choice. Though if you keep pacing like that, you'll wear a hole in the floor before the week is out." "I need to leave this house," she pleaded, her voice dropping from anger to desperation. "Just for an hour. The air in here smells like lilies and old lace. It smells like death, Silas. I can't breathe." Silas's expression softened, a rare crack in the architect of death's armor. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in her space, forcing her to look up at him. The scent of him, something metallic, something woodsy and entirely male, overwhelmed the cloying floral scent of the room. "The village is celebrating the feast day tonight," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There will be crowds. Noise. It's a security nightmare." "Please," she breathed, her eyes searching his for the man who used to lift her onto his shoulders to see the festival lights. "Dress in something dark. Something that doesn't scream Moretti," he commanded. "And if you try to run, Elara, I won't chase you. I'll simply bring you back over my shoulder." "Understood." An hour later, they were winding down the mountain paths in a nondescript SUV. The village below was a riot of color and light, strings of festoon lights crisscrossing the narrow cobblestone streets. For a moment, as she stepped out into the humid night air, Elara felt like the woman she had been in London. Free, anonymous, alive. But then she felt a hand on the small of her back. Silas was there, his touch a hot brand through the fabric of her dark sweater. He didn't let go, his body positioned so that he was a constant shield between her and the crowd. As they moved through the throng of villagers, Alara realized that people weren't just looking at her. They were parting like the Red Sea for the man at her side. They knew him. They feared him. "Stay close," he muttered against her ear, his breath hot against her skin. They reached the edge of the village square, where a band was playing traditional folk music. The joy of the crowd was infectious, and for a split second, Alara forgot the Regency clause. She turned to Silas, her eyes bright. "Dance with me." Silas stiffened. "I don't dance, Alara." "The great Silas Vance doesn't have a soul for music," she teased, her hand finding his. His skin was rough, calloused, and pulsing with a hidden heat. "Or are you afraid that if you let go of my waist for 5 seconds, I'll vanish into the shadows?" "I'm afraid of what happens if I don't let go," Silas rasped, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air between them changed, the festive music fading into a dull hum. In the middle of a crowded square, surrounded by hundreds of people, they were utterly alone. Alara could feel the conflict in him, the loyalty he owed her father fighting against the raw, visceral hunger he felt for the woman standing in front of him. Is it a betrayal to fall for the man meant to be your protector? Or is some love just inevitable? Let me know what you think in the comments, and subscribe to join our library. Suddenly, Silas's grip tightened, but not in a romantic gesture. He spun her around, his body shielding hers as his eyes scanned the rooftops above the square. His hand went to the small of his back, where his weapon was concealed. "What is it?" she whispered, her heart leaping into her throat. "We're leaving." "Now," he growled. He didn't explain. He simply hooked an arm around her waist and began navigating the crowd with brutal efficiency. Alara felt the shift in the atmosphere. The wolves her father had warned her about weren't just a metaphor. They were here, in the dark, watching the heiress and her sentinel. As they reached the car and sped back toward the safety of the fortress, Alara looked at Silas's profile, sharp and merciless in the dashboard light. He was her shadow, her protector, and her jailer. But as she touched the spot on her back where his hand had rested, she realized the greatest danger wasn't on the rooftops. It was in the room next to hers. The air in the villa grew colder as a Libeccio wind swept in from the sea, rattling the ancient window frames and carrying the scent of salt and impending rain. Alara found herself unable to sleep, the silence of the house amplified by the rhythmic, heavy tread of Silas in the room next door. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the way he had looked at her in the village square, the lethal protector melting into something far more primal. The realization that he had been watching her grow, not just with the eyes of a guardian but with the hunger of a man, made her skin feel too tight for her body. Restless and seeking some semblance of connection to the father who had so thoroughly trapped her, she began to sift through his private desk, a massive piece of Florentine craftsmanship that smelled of dried lavender and old secrets. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, a diary, a confession, perhaps a reason why her father would bind her to a man like Silas. Hidden behind a false panel in the velvet-lined drawer, her fingers brushed against a thick, cream-colored envelope. It wasn't addressed to her. To Silas, it read in her father's sharp, elegant cursive, "To be opened only if the dead is called." Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew she should wait and should hand it to him, but the desperation to understand the invisible chains holding her life together won out. She broke the wax seal and began to read. The letter was a revelation of blood and guilt. It spoke of a night in Palermo 2 decades ago, an ambush where Lorenzo had saved a young Silas from a rival's blade. But it was the final paragraph that made the breath leave her lungs. "I know the weight I have placed on your shoulders by giving you Alara," the letter read. "I have seen the way you look at her, the way you have looked at her since she was a girl, with a hunger you think I didn't see. You think your saint's mask hides the man beneath, but I know the darkness you carry. I am using that darkness, Silas. I am calling in the debt. Keep her safe, even if she hates you for it. Because if she loves you, Silas, she will never be able to do what must be done to the council." The letter slipped from Ilara's trembling fingers. Her father hadn't just known about Silas's attraction. He had weaponized it. He had tied them together, knowing that Silas's obsession would be the ultimate shield. He had traded Silas's soul for Ilara's safety, and in doing so, he had ensured they would both be miserable. The door to the dressing room creaked open. Silas stood there, bathed in the dim light of a single lamp. He saw the letter on the floor, and for the first time, his stoic mask shattered completely. He looked raw, exposed, and infinitely more dangerous. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said, his voice a low, jagged rasp that sent a shiver of terror and heat through her. "What debt, Silas?" Ilara demanded, stepping toward him, the letter clutched in her hand like a weapon. "What happened in Palermo? And what did he mean? About how you look at me? Was my entire childhood just a long-term observation for you?" Silas didn't answer immediately. He walked into her room, his presence filling the space until it felt like there wasn't enough oxygen for both of them. He reached down and took the letter from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. The contact felt like an electric shock. "The debt is my life, Ilara," he whispered, staring down at her father's handwriting as if it were a death warrant. "Your father saved me when I was a boy with nothing but a knife and a grudge. He gave me a name. He gave me a purpose. And in exchange, I gave him my soul. Part of that deal was staying away from you. Or at least, pretending to. But you didn't, did you?" Ilara challenged, her voice dropping to a whisper. She could see the pulse jumping in his neck, the raw effort it took for him to stay still while she was so close. "You stayed in the shadows. You watched me leave for London. You watched me try to be normal. All the while, you were waiting for the Regency to kick in." "I wasn't waiting," Silas growled, dropping the letter and grabbing her by the waist, pulling her flush against him. The scent of him was overwhelming now. Musk rain and the cold metal of the weapon at his hip. "I was trying to survive you. You think it's easy? Watching you become everything your father feared? Watching you look at me like I'm the monster under your bed, when all I want to do is burn the world down just to see you smile." "My father trusted you because he knew you'd never touch me," Ilara breathed, her hands coming up to rest on his broad chest, feeling the frantic, heavy thud of his heart. "He thought your loyalty to him was stronger than your desire for me." "He was wrong," Silas rasped, his face inches from hers. "He was wrong about a lot of things. But he was right about the council. They're coming for us, Ilara. And if we're going to survive, I can't just be your guardian anymore. I have to be the man he was afraid I'd become." He let her go as abruptly as he had grabbed her, his chest heaving. The vulnerability in his eyes was fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold, hard steel of the architect of death. He looked at the letter on the floor, then back at her, a silent acknowledgement that the invisible line between them had been crossed. "Get some rest," he commanded, turning toward the door. "Tomorrow, we go to the summit. You need to be ready to play, Donna. And I need to remember my place if I still have one." As the door clicked shut, Ilara sat on the edge of her bed, the silence of the villa now screaming with the weight of the secret they shared. Her father hadn't just left her a kingdom. He had left her a predator who was struggling to keep his chains from snapping. The Moretti estate was no longer a house of mourning. It had been transformed into a theater of strategic deception. Hundreds of beeswax candles flickered in the grand ballroom, their honeyed light reflecting off the crystal chandeliers and the polished barrels of concealed weapons. This was the summit of the Seven Hills, a gathering of the Mediterranean's most dangerous men, convened to witness the formal introduction of the new Donna. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, roasted meats, and the metallic tang of hidden intent. Elara stood before the floor-length mirror in her suite, her breath hitching as she looked at the woman staring back. To play the role of the Moretti heir, she had chosen a dress of midnight blue velvet that appeared almost black in the shadows. It was modest in the front, with a high collar that signaled authority, but the back was slashed to the waist, revealing the vulnerable curve of her spine. She draped her father's heavy gold medallion around her neck, a symbol of a legacy she still wanted to burn, yet one she had to wield like a shield. A low, rhythmic knock at the door signaled her time was up. She opened it to find Silas waiting. He was dressed in a black tuxedo that made him look less like a bodyguard and more like a dark prince. His eyes traveled slowly over her, lingering on the exposed skin of her back before snapping back to her face with a disciplined coldness that didn't quite reach the heat in his gaze. "The council is waiting," he said, his voice a low vibration. "They expect to see a girl they can bully into a marriage contract. Show them the Donna instead." "And what do you expect to see, Silas?" she asked, stepping into his space, the scent of her jasmine perfume mingling with his crisp ozone. "The girl you're protecting out of debt, or the woman who found the letter?" Silas's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his cheek. "Tonight, I am a ghost. I am the shadow behind your throne. Nothing more." As they descended the grand staircase, the roar of conversation in the ballroom died into a jagged, expectant silence. Elara felt the weight of 100 predatory gazes. At the far end of the room sat the council, 5 men whose ages and sins were etched into their weathered faces. Beside them stood the suitors, younger men with hungry eyes who saw Elara as a prize to be won and dismantled. Silas remained exactly 3 paces behind her, a silent, terrifying anchor. His presence was a physical warning. Several men who had stepped forward to greet her hesitated, their eyes darting to the architect of death, whose hand rested casually near his silk waistband. Elara Moretti, the eldest council member, Don Grizzy, barked, his voice like gravel. "You look much like your father. We hope you possess his wisdom. The Moretti interests require a firm hand, a husband's hand." "The Moretti interests are currently under the Regency," Elara replied, her voice steady and clear, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "And the Regent has found no candidate worthy of the bloodline." She felt Silas's gaze on the back of her neck, a hot, prickling sensation. She moved through the room with a calculated grace, stopping to speak with the Dons, using the very charm she had honed in London to disarm them. But every time a man leaned in too close, or a hand lingered too long on her arm, she felt the atmosphere shift. Silas was a coiled spring, his protective instinct warring with the professional mask he wore. By midnight, the tension was a living thing. Elara found herself cornered by Marcello, her cousin, whose arrogance was as thick as his cologne. He caught her by the wrist, his thumb grazing her pulse point in a way that made her skin crawl. "The Regency won't last forever, Elara," Marcello whispered, his eyes dark with a cruel intent. "Eventually, Silas will have to step aside. Why wait for the council to choose? I can give you a reason to choose me tonight." Before Elara could retort, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Silas didn't just walk over. He appeared. He didn't touch Marcello, but the way he loomed over the younger man made the entire ballroom hold its breath. "The Donna's hand is for the Moretti family to give, not for a pup to grab," Silas rasped, his voice a low, terrifying promise of violence. "Let go of her, Marcello." "No. Before I forget, we are under a flag of truce." Marcello looked into Silas's eyes and saw that the saint was gone, replaced by the predator. He released her immediately, his face paling as he stepped back into the crowd. "Now, tell me in the comments, is Silas's possessiveness a sign of true love, or is he just another man trying to control the Moretti throne? Leave a comment and subscribe to join the library." Elara didn't wait for the fallout. She turned and walked toward the terrace, the cool night air a welcome relief after the stifling heat of the gala. She heard the heavy tread of Silas's boots behind her. "You were supposed to be a ghost," she said, spinning around to face him. Her heart was racing, not from the confrontation with Marcello, but from the raw possessiveness she had seen in Silas's eyes. "Some ghosts can't help but haunt the living," Silas growled, stepping into the moonlight. "You were playing a dangerous game in there, Ilara. Using me to provoke them." "I wasn't using you to provoke them," she whispered, stepping closer until her chest brushed the lapels of his tuxedo. "I was using them to see if you'd finally break." Silas's hand shot out, catching her by the waist and pulling her flush against him. The architect's mask was gone, shattered by a hunger that had been decades in the making. "Careful, Ilara," he breathed against her lips. "If I break, I'm taking you down with me." The gala of wolves had ended in a stalemate of whispered threats and calculating stares, but the air inside the Moretti estate remained electric, thick with the residue of unvented adrenaline and unspoken truths. Ilara couldn't sleep. The midnight blue velvet of her dress felt like a second skin she was desperate to shed, and the image of Silas standing over Marcello haunted the back of her eyelids. She needed to move. She needed the earth under her feet to remind her that she wasn't just a ghost in her father's house, a spirit bound by a regency clause she hadn't asked for. She slipped out of her suite, her bare feet silent on the cold marble floors. She bypassed the main staircase, taking a narrow stone passage that led down toward the ancient Moretti winery, a subterranean labyrinth of oak barrels and cool damp air that had been in her family for centuries. She thought she was alone until she reached the lowest level, where the largest casks of vintage grappa were stored. Silas was there. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket and waistcoat, his white shirt dampened by the humidity of the cellar, clinging to the broad, scarred planes of his back. He was leaning against a massive oak barrel, a glass of dark liquid in his hand, staring into the shadows. He didn't turn when she entered, but the sudden tightening of his shoulders told her he knew exactly who was standing there. The silence between them was heavy, vibrating with the ghost of the confrontation in the ballroom. "You should be in your room, Ilara," he said, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceiling like a low roll of thunder. "The council members are still on the grounds. The truce is paper-thin tonight." "I'm tired of being told where I should be," Ilara replied, walking toward him. The scent of fermenting grapes and cold stone was intoxicating, grounding her in a way the ballroom hadn't. "You were supposed to be my guardian, Silas. But tonight, in that ballroom, you looked like you wanted to kill every man who breathed my air. Is that part of the debt you owe my father? Or is it something else?" Silas finally turned, his eyes dark and turbulent in the flickering torchlight. He set his glass down on the barrel with a sharp, final click. "You know it's not. You found the letter. You know exactly what's happening here, even if you're too afraid to say the words." "Then why are you still fighting it?" she challenged, stopping just inches from him. The heat radiating from his body was a physical force, an invitation, and a warning all at once. "My father is gone. The debt is paid. Why stay in the shadows of a role that no longer fits you?" "Because if I step into the light, I ruin you," Silas rasped, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "Your father wanted you to rule this family. If the council sees that the architect has claimed the Donna, they won't see a union of loyalty. They'll see a coup. They'll kill us both before the sun comes up to restore their version of order." "Let them try," Ilara whispered. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the rough silk of his shirt, feeling the frantic, heavy thud of his heart beneath. "I'm tired of living for his legacy, Silas. I want to live for something real, even if it's dangerous, even if it's wrong." Silas let out a low, guttural groan, the sound of a man reaching the end of his endurance, the snap of a tether held too tight for too long. He grabbed her wrists, his grip firm but not painful, pinning them against the oak barrel behind her. He loomed over her, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her lips. "You have no idea what you're asking for," he breathed. "I am not a good man, Elara. I am the man your father used to do the things he couldn't. I am the shadow. I am the violence." "Then be my violence," she countered, her gaze unwavering, her soul bared to him in the dark. The trust that had been the foundation of their lives for a decade finally snapped. Silas leaned in, his mouth crashing against hers in a kiss that was a collision of desperation, suppressed hunger, and a decade of unsaid words. It wasn't soft. It was a battle. Elara wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck as the world outside the winery ceased to exist. In the dark of the cellar, surrounded by the history of a family built on blood and secrets, the line between protector and lover was incinerated. Silas's hands traveled down her back, tracing the exposed curve of her spine, his touch a hot brand on her skin. For the first time since she had returned to Sicily, Elara didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a woman who had finally found the fire she needed to burn the cage down. Would you honor a dead man's trust, or follow a heart that beats for the one person who is strictly off-limits? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe to join our library. Silas eventually pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing hard, their hearts echoing each other in the stillness. The silence of the winery felt different now, heavy with a new kind of secret, one more dangerous than any ledger. "Everything changes now," Silas whispered, his voice jagged and raw. "There is no going back to the way things were. The council will find out. Your father's plan. It's shattered." "Good," Elara replied, her eyes burning with a dark newfound resolve. "I never liked his plan anyway. I like ours better." Silas reached out, his thumb grazing her lower lip, his expression a mix of adoration and terror. He knew the war was coming. He knew that by claiming Donna, he had signaled the end of the peace Lorenzo had bought with his life. But as he looked at Elara, standing tall in the shadows of her ancestors, he knew he would burn the entire island to the ground before he let her go. The dawn that followed their encounter in the winery was gray and heavy, a thick mist rolling off the Mediterranean to swallow the Moretti estate in a ghostly shroud. Inside the villa, the air felt different, charged with the lingering heat of their transgression and the cold reality of the war it had invited. Elara sat in the grand library, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight against the morning light. She hadn't slept, the weight of Silas's kiss still burned on her lips, but her mind was consumed by the ledger she had retrieved from the deepest vault of the Moretti archives. Silas stood by the door, his presence a silent, protective shadow. He had returned to his role as the stoic sentinel, but the way his gaze lingered on the curve of her neck told a different story. They were no longer just guardian and ward. They were conspirators in a game where the stakes were their very lives. "You've been staring at those accounts for 3 hours, Elara," Silas said, his voice a low, melodic rumble in the quiet room. "The council is meeting at the docks. We should be preparing for the retaliation, not chasing ghosts in the ledgers." "These aren't just ghosts, Silas," Elara replied, her voice sharp with a sudden, chilling realization. She beckoned him over, her finger tracing a series of encrypted entries dated just weeks before her father's death. "Look at the liquidation patterns. My father wasn't just managing the business. He was stripping it. He was moving massive amounts of capital out of the Moretti accounts and into a private offshore fund, one that requires 2 signatures to access." Silas leaned over her shoulder, the scent of cedar and rain enveloping her. He studied the numbers, his brow furrowing. Lorenzo was a strategist, but he never weakened the family's foundation unless he was preparing for a siege. "Who is the second signature?" "It's not mine," Elara whispered, turning the page to a scanned copy of a notarized agreement. It's Don Grizzy's, the head of the council. The silence that followed was deafening. The very man who had been pressuring Alara to marry was the one who held the keys to her father's drained empire. Silas's jaw tightened, his hand dropping instinctively to the grip of the weapon at his hip. He wasn't protecting the family from the wolves, Alara said, her voice trembling. He was being eaten by them. Grizzy wasn't his advisor. He was his blackmailer. He was forcing him to bleed the Moretti name dry, and when he ran out of blood, he killed him. Silas's eyes flared with a murderous intensity. The toxicology report said it was a heart attack. Natural causes. A heart attack brought on by a specific digitalis derivative that leaves the system within hours, Alara countered, pointing to a medical note tucked into the back of the ledger. My father knew he was dying. That's why he wrote that letter to you. He didn't trust the council because he knew they were the ones who ordered his execution. The Regency clause wasn't a cage for me, Silas. It was a barricade against him. Silas walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the guards patrolling the perimeter. If Grizzy knows you have this ledger, he won't wait for a wedding. He'll move tonight. He needs you dead so he can claim the funds as the sole surviving signatory. Then we don't give him the chance, Alara said, standing up, her father's gold medallion catching the light. We've been playing his game, Silas. Waiting for the council to dictate our lives. It's time we remind them why the Moretti name was feared for 100 years. Silas turned back to her, a grim, admiring smile touching his lips. He walked toward her, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. This time, there was no hesitation, no debt to hold him back. I spent 20 years serving a man who played by the rules of the old world. I think I'd much rather serve a Donna who is ready to burn the old world down. The money in that account is enough to buy every mercenary from here to Rome, Alara said, her eyes flashing with a dark, inherited fire. But we need Grizzy's signature, or his biometric override. We need to get him alone. The council is hosting a private dinner at the hunting lodge tonight, Silas noted, his voice turning cold and professional. They think you're broken. They think I'm still the loyal dog. It's the perfect place for an accident. Alara reached out, her fingers tangling with Silas's. The bloody secret of her father's death had changed everything. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about vengeance. The woman who had fled to London was gone, replaced by someone who understood that in Sicily, justice was only ever written in red. Prepare the men you trust, Silas, Alara commanded. The ones who aren't on Grizzy's payroll. Tonight, we show them that the Moretti line hasn't ended. It's just evolved. As you wish, Donna, Silas murmured, leaning down to press a lingering, lethal kiss to her brow. The hunting lodge was a rustic, stone-walled structure buried deep in the dense forests of the Moretti Highlands, a place where the air was thick with the scent of pine and the cold, sharp bite of the mountain wind. Traditionally, it was a site of celebration after a successful harvest or a diplomatic hunt, but tonight, it felt like a tomb waiting for its occupants. The jagged peaks of the mountains silhouetted against the moonless sky seemed to hem the world in, creating a theater of isolation. Alara sat at the head of the long, rough-hewn oak table, the gold medallion of her father resting heavy against her chest, a weight that felt more like a weapon than a piece of jewelry. To her right sat Don Grizzy, his face a mask of grandfatherly concern that no longer fooled her for a second. The other 4 members of the council flanked them, their bodyguards standing like statues against the shadows of the timber-framed walls. The meal was a decadent spread of wild boar and vintage wines, but the flavor was ash in Alara's mouth. Silas was not in the room. By Grizzy's decree, all personal security had been left in the courtyard. It was a move designed to isolate her, to make her feel the suffocating weight of her vulnerability. But as Alara sipped her dark wine, she felt a cold, crystalline calm. She knew that Silas wasn't outside. He was in the very bones of the building, moving through the servant passages he had mapped out years ago as a boy. "The girl is quiet tonight," Don Grizzy noted, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that set her teeth on edge. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive cigars and rot. "Perhaps she finally understands that the burden of the Moretti name is too much for a woman to carry alone. We have finalized the contract with Marcello's family. The wedding will take place in October. It is the only way to stabilize the accounts." Elara set her glass down, the sharp clack of crystal against wood echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "The wedding won't be happening, Grizzy. Neither will the liquidation of the Swiss accounts. I've reviewed the ledgers. I know about the digitalis derivative." The air in the room curdled instantly. The council members froze, their forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting to Grizzy. The grandfatherly mask slipped, revealing the shark beneath. Grizzy's eyes narrowed into slits. "You've been digging where you shouldn't, child. Your father died because he forgot his place in the order of things. Don't make the same mistake." "My father died because you were a parasite," Elara countered, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You bled him dry and then you discarded him. But you forgot one thing. You left me the keys to the house, and I've invited a guest you weren't expecting." Grizzy laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Guest? You have nothing. Your architect is outside, surrounded by 20 of my best men. You are alone at a table of kings." He raised a hand, a signal to the guards at the door to move in and seize her. But the doors didn't open. Instead, the lights flickered and died, plunging the lodge into an absolute suffocating darkness. In the blackness, the silence was shattered by the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a suppressed weapon, a sound Elara had learned to associate with safety. Screams erupted as the council's bodyguards were cut down before they could even draw their pieces. Elara dove beneath the heavy oak table, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she wasn't afraid. She knew the rhythm of that gunfire. It was the heartbeat of her protection. When the emergency lanterns hummed to life seconds later, casting a ghastly red glow over the room, the scene was a gallery of carnage. The council's guards were slumped against the walls, and Silas stood in the doorway. He was in full tactical gear, splattered with crimson, his eyes fixed on Grizzy with a terrifying singular focus. Grizzy scrambled back, his chair toppling over. He reached for a hidden pistol in his waistband, but a shot rang out from Silas's sidearm, shattering the bones in Grizzy's hand. He let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail, clutching his mangled limb as he fell to the floor. Elara crawled out from under the table, standing tall amidst the ruins of the council's power. She walked toward Grizzy, who was now cowering. Silas stepped up behind her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. The heat of him was the only thing that kept the world from spinning. "The signature, Grizzy," Elara commanded, pulling a digital tablet from her small evening bag. "Transfer the funds back to the Moretti Primary Trust. All of it. Now, or Silas won't aim for your hand next time." You can't do this," Grizzy wheezed, his face pale with shock. "The other families, they will tear you apart for this. The other families will see a Donna who ended a traitor," Silas rasped, stepping forward and pressing the warm barrel of his rifle against Grizzy's temple. "They will see that the Moretti line isn't weak. It's just been cleaned." With a shaking, bloody hand, Grizzy pressed his thumb to the tablet scanner and whispered the verbal override codes. Elara watched the progress bar on the screen reach 100%. The wealth of her family, the blood money her father had died for, was finally back where it belonged. "What now?" Grizzy sobbed, looking up at them. "Will you kill me in cold blood?" Elara looked at Silas. She saw the man she loved, the man who had been a ghost for her, and she saw the future they could have. but she also saw the memory of her father's slow, agonizing betrayal. "No," Elara said, her voice as cold as the mountain air. "I won't kill you. Silas. Give him the same natural heart attack he gave my father. Let the world see a tired old man who couldn't handle the shame of his failures." Silas nodded, a grim, professional respect in his eyes. He reached into his kit for the small, pressurized needle. Elara walked out of the hunting lodge and into the crisp night air, the sounds of Grizzy's muffled pleas fading behind her. She looked up at the stars, feeling the first true breath of freedom she had known since she was a girl. The debt was paid. The vengeance was hers. And in the shadows, her sentinel was waiting to help her build something new. The morning sun rose over the Sicilian coastline, but it did not bring the usual warmth. Instead, it cast a sharp, clinical light over the Moretti estate, illuminating the transition from a house of mourning to the seat of a new, formidable power. The hunting lodge was a memory now, a dark secret buried in the high woods, and the council was a hollow shell. 3 of its members had fled into exile the moment the news of Grizzy's unfortunate passing reached them, and the remaining 2 had spent the night on their knees in the villa's foyer, begging for an audience with the woman they had once dismissed as a pawn. Elara stood on the master balcony, dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit that mirrored the armor her father had worn for decades. But where Lorenzo had looked cold and burdened, Elara looked alive. Her gaze swept over the lemon groves and the distant shimmer of the sea, her mind no longer clouded by the confusion of her London life. She was no longer the girl who had run away to hide from her shadow. She was the woman who had walked through the fire and realized the shadow was hers to command. Behind her, the glass doors creaked open. She didn't need to turn to know it was Silas. She could feel the shift in the air, the way the atmosphere seemed to tighten and spark whenever he entered her space. He walked to her side, his movements fluid and silent, no longer the watchful sentinel but the partner in a blood-soaked pact. He wore no jacket, his white sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and for the first time in years, the gun at his hip looked like a tool of his trade rather than a burden of his debt. "The transfers are complete," Silas said, his voice a low, melodic gravel that stirred the air against her neck. "The funds are back in the Moretti accounts. The mercenaries Grizzy hired have been paid off to leave the island, and the local families have sent their representatives. They're waiting in the ballroom to swear their fealty to the new Donna." Elara turned to look at him. The saint was gone, replaced by a man who looked at her with a terrifying, absolute devotion. The lines of his face were still hard, but the conflict that had haunted him for 19 years had vanished. "And the council? They are waiting for your judgment," Silas replied, his eyes searching hers. "They want to know if the regency is over." Elara reached into the pocket of her trousers and pulled out the heavy iron key to the Moretti vaults, the same key she had once viewed as a symbol of her imprisonment. She looked at it for a long moment before holding it out to Silas. He didn't take it. Instead, he reached out and closed her fingers over the metal, his large, warm hand enveloping hers. "The regency is over," Elara whispered, stepping closer until their foreheads touched, the heat between them eclipsing the morning chill. "But I'm not ruling this empire alone, Silas. My father wanted a guardian for his daughter. I want a king for my Donna." Silas let out a jagged breath, his composure finally fracturing as he pulled her into him. His arms were a familiar solid weight that anchored her to the earth. "I've spent half my life waiting for you to see me, Elara. Not as the man who served your father, but as the man who would burn heaven to keep you safe. If you keep me by your side, there is no turning back. The world will see us as usurpers. They will never stop hunting us." "Let them hunt," Elara challenged, her gaze burning with a dark inherited resolve. "They'll find out that a Moretti and a Vance together are a force the old world isn't ready for. We aren't just surviving anymore, Silas. We're building something they can't touch." She leaned in, And this time the kiss wasn't a battle or a desperate goodbye. It was a coronation. In the quiet of the morning, with the scent of lemons and salt spray hanging in the air, they sealed a new law. The forbidden attraction that had been a source of shame was now the foundation of their throne. Can Alara and Silas truly find peace, or is their love destined to be as violent as the world they rule? Leave your final thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel to join our library. Alara pulled back, taking the gold medallion from around her neck. She walked to the edge of the balcony and, with a flick of her wrist, tossed the heavy gold disc into the dense green of the groves below. She didn't need her father's jewelry to prove who she was. The power was in her blood, and the man at her side was her chosen sword. "Come," she said, reaching back to take Silas's hand. "The wolves are waiting to be led." As they walked through the grand foyer, the remaining council members bowed their heads, their faces pale with a new, frantic respect. Alara didn't stop to acknowledge them. She walked straight to the heavy mahogany doors of the study, the room where her father had signed away her freedom. She threw the doors open and took her seat at the head of the desk. Silas didn't stand behind her this time. He took the chair beside her, his hand resting openly on the desk next to hers. The message was clear to everyone in the room. The shadow had moved to the light, and Donna was no longer alone. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. The world outside the villa continued to spin, the Sicilian sun climbing higher into the sky, but within the walls of the Moretti estate, a new era had begun. It was an empire built on the ruins of betrayal and the ashes of a father's secrets, held together by a love that had defied every law of the underworld. Alara looked at Silas, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips. "Now," she said to the room at large, her voice echoing with the strength of a woman who had finally claimed her destiny, "let's discuss the new rules. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. Thank you for being part of the Helen Romance Library." The end.